Good afternoon and good evening in Jerusalem. Um, Today is day 494 of the war that has been actually that Israel has been asked to fight on multiple fronts. We're honored today to be able to interview our dear friend and colleague, Alex Trayman. Alex was one of the journalists that was selected not only to travel with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu back to Jerusalem, but to participate in the White House press conference, and he was pre-selected to question both the president and the prime minister. Alex is the CEO and Jerusalem bureau chief of the Jewish News Syndicate and host of Jerusalem Minute, a seasoned Israeli journalist, documentary filmmaker of the outstanding film Iranian, which is where Alex and I met or how we met, and a startup consultant. He is an expert on Israeli politics and on US-Israel relations. Alex has interviewed top political figures, including Israeli leaders, US senators, and national security issues officials with insights featured on major networks. He's been interviewed on the BBC, Bloomberg, CBS, NBC, Fox, and Newsmax.
And
Um, and then many others, and his wonderful editorials and articles from JNS have been picked up by the New York Post, Newsmax, and many other outlets. Alex, in your last column, you wrote, quote, just 2 weeks after Trump entered his second term of office, Israel's strategic position has changed dramatically. Can you please delineate on that for our audience and explain how has Israel's strategic position changed?
oh, absolutely. I mean, I think now the state of Israel has the complete backing of the world's largest and most powerful superpower, the United States of America. I only can imagine what the situation would have looked like if President Trump had not won the 2024 election, if Kamala Harris had ascended the presidency and brought her advisors, many of whom have long anti-Israel and pro-Iran and pro-Palestinian records, into the national security establishment and State Department and elsewhere. And now with all of the footage, the drone footage, satellite pictures, reporting coming out of Gaza, where it's becoming more and more clear the level of utter devastation that has been caused by the IDF offensive in the Gaza Strip. I think that Israel was on a fast track towards a diplomatic tsunami if the Harris administration was in place. And, when the prime minister came to the United States back in July, when he addressed the joint sessions of Congress and he met with Biden and then met, who had just bowed out of the race, and then met with Kamala Harris. I can tell you that and I was there in Washington at the time and was briefed by the prime minister during that trip. I can tell you that there was a lot of tension, a lot of anxiety, and this trip was totally different. It was really a feeling that Israel was being backed by a true friend, and you already are seeing how President Trump is talking about resettling Gazans. I mean, it's a totally different track than the Biden administration, which doubled down on the policy that not a single Gazan was allowed to leave. And we haven't even begun to talk about Iran, but certainly the Biden administration trying to prevent a military strike by Israel on Iran's nuclear facilities. And we have to see what the Trump administration will bring. But I think that there's a lot more backing for Israel to meet what Prime Minister Netanyahu laid out as a strategy for total victory.
So, Alex, you are very friendly with many in the Prime Minister's inner circle, including your former contributing editor, Carolyn Glick, and our good friend, who is now Prime Minister Netanyahu's International Affairs Advisor. So, can you explain the response among them about President Trump's idea of U.S. ownership of the Gaza Strip and making the Gaza Strip into the Riviera on the Mediterranean?
Well, I think when it comes to the idea to relocate Gazans outside of the Strip, this did not take the Prime Minister by surprise. This is something that I believe that the Prime Minister spoke about with Donald Trump, even in the run up to the election. You know, the Prime Minister has been pretty vague about what total victory would mean. Other than the return of the hostages and the guaranteeing that Hamas would no longer run the Gaza Strip and that Gaza would not pose a threat to Israel. But when it came to who governs the Gaza Strip afterwards, the prime minister was very, very vague about that. Um, so when the president said that he wanted to see Gazans resettled in Egypt or Jordan, I don't think this part was a surprise. But in the press briefing that the president and prime minister gave together, it seemed like the president was sort of ruminating on his own idea as he was going off script at the press conference, and you know, it's been reported that his idea that the United States would take an ownership position was unscripted. And the idea that it would be turned into a Riviera on the Mediterranean. I mean, obviously, if you're going to rebuild it from scratch, you know, build it nice, you know, make it great. The idea of America owning it, you know, we don't know if this is an extreme bargaining position, if this is a real idea. But you know, there's two questions. There's questions of property ownership and there's questions of sovereignty, right? So there's that issue hasn't been addressed yet. You know, I think that even if the president does want to have some ownership over Gaza, I mean, if they're going to be the developers, and you know, we don't know if that's the country, the United States of America is getting into the development business, or if that's American contractors that are going to be willing to come in and bulldoze the wreckage and you know lay foundations for new buildings. You know, maybe that means American companies are going to be property owners in the Gaza Strip, but I'm sure that Israel wants to remain, retake the sovereignty over the Gaza Strip, a sovereignty that it gave up in 2005 when it evacuated 8,500 Jewish residents from 21 thriving Jewish communities in what was called Gush Katif. So we have to see what the president really means. I think it's all going to start to become more clear in the weeks ahead.
Right, right. Unfortunately, the response from the Arab world hasn't been very favorable. Saudi Arabia's Prince Mohammed bin Salman has firmly affirmed that his nation's position is, quote, clear and explicit, that it does not allow for any interpretation under any circumstances. Jordan's foreign minister, Marwan Marshaz, called Trump's plan to resettle Palestinians in Jordan, quote, an existential issue and not something that Jordanians would entertain. And you see that King Abdullah has at least postponed his meeting with President Trump that was supposed to take place um, next week. Um,
No, King
so,
Abdullah is there today, and I think that meeting's taking place. I think
ah,
President El Sisi of Egypt has postponed his trip, from what I've
oh, it's
seen.
President. I'm sorry. Okay. So, um, that's exactly right. I'm sorry. So, what, and do you think that the Qataris, the Emiratis, the Saudis, will be able to help fund this plan?
Well, there's two issues. There's the first issue is who will accept Gazans to live in their territory, and then second
Right,
is who will help fund either the resettlement and
right.
or the rebuilding of the Gaza Strip. You know, I think when it comes to Jordan and Egypt, they're not being looked at to fund this. They're being looked at to host Palestinians, and obviously the natural place for Gazans to go if they do leave the Gaza Strip is across the southern border that the Gaza Strip has with Egypt. And Egypt has locked that border, not allowing a single Palestinian to come in, even though the Sinai Peninsula is a very large territory, mostly empty. And even in the past, there's been ideas floated prior to this war about extending the Gaza Strip into the Sinai Peninsula and giving this densely populated area room to grow, so to speak. So, you know, and Jordan, it has a population of about 11 million people, of which more than half of them are Palestinians. About 6 million Palestinians living in Jordan. And many argue that Jordan is a Palestinian state. Whether or not King Abdullah of Jordan wants it to be considered as such, he's worried that if he is seen as facilitating the resettlement of Palestinians, that he would lose popularity, further popularity among his own street, of which is predominantly Palestinians. He doesn't want to do that. At the same time, he also remembers Black September in 1970, where Palestinian factions basically tried to unseat his father, King Hussein. And so they're very weary of having Palestinians come in. The Egyptians, have El Sisi took over Egypt from the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood is a very strong faction in Egypt, and Hamas is a sister of the Muslim Brotherhood. So there's good reasons why these countries don't want to see Palestinians come in. That said, President Trump has a lot of leverage over these countries. I mean, if you're talking just about Jordan, Jordan receives over $1.5 billion in foreign aid from the United States, of which actually that was frozen, as the president has basically frozen all foreign aid to all countries, with the exception of Israel and Egypt, according to an announcement last week. In addition, the security services, the intelligence services of Jordan, received millions of dollars in unannounced amounts from the United States, including from the CIA. Um, and then when you look at Egypt, Egypt also receives a tremendous amount of military aid, financing from the United States. And Egypt has actually been one of the potentially unintended casualties of this war, because the Houthis, in attacking Israel and trying to put an economic siege on Israel, has basically shut off the majority of commercial traffic through the Suez Canal. Where ships from China that are going to Europe, they're not going through the Suez Canal anymore. They're going around the southern tip of Africa, and the Suez Canal is one of the top, if not the top, source of revenue for Egypt. So they've lost a lot of money. They borrowed recently $1.5 billion in emergency loans. And if Trump waves the economic carrots and sticks in front of the leaders of both Jordan and Egypt, I think there's a good chance that they might open up their borders and accept at least some group of the population of Palestinians. And I think the question is, like, will one country do it first? And then you might see the Saudis also come in and do that. There's always been talk, and it depends who you ask, because the Israelis will tell you that this is not true. But in public statements, the Saudis always say that normalization with Israel, has to parallel a pathway towards some kind of a Palestinian state. They don't say that a Palestinian state has to be declared right away, but some pathway towards a Palestinian state. Now, again, the Israelis, Netanyahu, Ron Dermer, the Minister of Strategic Affairs, they say that the Saudis don't care that much about the Palestinians. Uh, However, when you hear about a pathway toward a Palestinian state, well, where is that Palestinian state? Does that Palestinian state need to be between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, or that river and the sea that all those Hamas supporters scream about on the streets of Western capitals when they don't know that it's the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea? Maybe that Palestinian state is going to get created someplace in Egypt, and maybe it's going to be created someplace in Saudi Arabia, or maybe reality is going to set in, and people are going to realize that Jordan is the Palestinian state.
Right. So a couple of 100,000 Palestinians going into Jordan is not going to really change the demographics that much. I mean, if there's just, and the thing is that we have to frame it in terms of freedom of movement for people that want better lives for their families, a rite of passage, a humanitarian corridor, not the words of the left of forced transfer, ethnic cleansing. But don't you agree that, beginning with, a few 100,000 who at least, want to establish what most refugees have established after times of war? They've been considered refugees since UNRWA was established. That this would not really change the dynamics of either country.
Well, I think that the prime minister has been using language similar to the language that you've used. He says that if the gates were open, that this would longer be an open air prison, that it's an open air prison
Right.
because people are not allowed to leave it. And that if the
Right.
doors were open, that many Palestinians would leave Gaza. And he says that even before the war, Palestinians were clamoring to leave the Gaza Strip. And when you see the pictures now and the videos coming out of Gaza, they don't have anywhere to live. Okay, and if you really look at it, I mean, during the war, Hamas, Yahya Sinwar, and the terrorists, they were running around in the tunnels under Gaza like sewer rats. And now you see what Israel's done above the ground, and you have Palestinians, running around the wreckage in Gaza, and they look the same. I mean, the Hamas brought, they wanted to be like running around in the underground sewer system, and they brought that sewer system to the surface, basically. So where are Gazans going to live in Gaza? The Steve Woodcock, the president, have referred to Gaza as a demolition site. They say it's going to take 10 to 15 years to rebuild it, and these are real estate developers. Okay, so um, when Russia started its invasion of the Ukraine, you had over 6 million Ukrainians fled to the borders, and the question was who's going to take Ukrainian refugees, and they didn't all go to one place. I mean, even Israel took in over 30,000 Ukrainian refugees. So on the one hand, the question is, will Jordan or Egypt or Saudi Arabia take in hundreds of thousands of Palestinians? But I'm not hearing calls from any one country around the world saying, I'm willing to take in 10,000 Palestinians. How come there's not one country in the entire world that is saying we will not take even one Palestinian? You know, it just goes to show you what the world thinks of Palestinians. Okay, nobody cares about Palestinians. If they did, they would want to provide a better life from them amidst this horrific suffering that they brought upon themselves, but suffering nonetheless. It seems like the entire world only wants them to be in Gaza because they use that population as a pawn to delegitimize and demonize the Jewish state because apparently they hate Jews more than they hate the Palestinians.
Exactly. Okay, so we all watched with horror this past weekend when the emaciated, gaunt bodies of Ali Sharabi, or Levy, and Ahmed Ben Ami were returned after their hellish 491 days of captivity in Gaza. Um, and of course, Ali Sharabi had to come home and find out that his wife, Leon, and his two teenage daughters had been murdered on October 7th. So remember, these are innocent Israeli civilians in exchange for 183 pardoned Palestinian terrorists. Um, what and we also saw with repeated horror as the Hamas official Abba Abida had said that quote Israel's obstructing the ceasefire. How do you respond to something like this? I mean, Israel just withdrew from the Netzarim corridor. How would you respond to that as well?
Well, there's a lot of questions here. I mean, the first is the nature of the hostage release deal itself. I mean, it is an unjust and an immoral deal. Okay,
Right.
there's no way to square that peg. It's not balanced. I mean, yes, among those that are being released are Palestinians, Gazans that were arrested during the war and were basically arrested explicitly for this purpose of being traded at the end for the hostages. Israel had to take capital that it could trade later. But yes, you mentioned that many of the prisoners that are being released are coming from Israeli prisons for acts of terror that they committed against Israelis prior to October 7th, and a good percentage of these have blood on their hands, and many of them are serving consecutive life sentences. And a lot of these terrorists are going back right to where they came from in eastern sections of Jerusalem, or to their communities in what Israelis call Judea and Samaria, but what the rest of the world refers to as the West Bank, where we know statistically that chances are that they are going to commit acts of terror again. I mean, it's already math. Like we know this for a fact that that there's percentages here of that they are going to go back to commit acts of terror. But I think that the prime minister and his team, they see this as a bump in the road, and there is a tremendous sense of urgency to get the hostages back. I mean that it's a goal that in the strategy of a grander war, it's not that many people, and 1,200 people already died, and why do you care so much about the hostages? But that goes to show you just how much Israelis do care about every single last individual, and the extreme ends that they will go to get these hostages back. But I think you have to view the deal in the context of what happened before. Israel has killed, according to its estimates, 18,000 terrorists. Uh, if this deal goes through in its entirety, Israel will release 1,900 terrorists. So Israel has basically eliminated, by that math, over 16,000 terrorists if it gave 2,000 back. Um, and you also have to judge it on the basis of what happens after. And if you hear the president talking about now resettling the Gazans, and also making sure that Hamas is no longer in power, well, who's holding the hostages? Hamas. So how are you going to incentivize getting these hostages out? So unfortunately, if you want to get them out, if Israel could have rescued them, they would have rescued them. They have 15 months. They did rescue a handful, and those were very daring and incredible operations that brought a few hostages home. I think about 8 hostages were rescued, but clearly many more are being released in these hostage deals. So you have to just trade whatever you can trade in order to get these hostages back and suck it up, basically. But and what were the second and the third questions there that you asked?
Okay, in terms of, well, another question that is, President Trump had said that if the remaining hostages
Right.
are not released, that Hamas will have all hell to pay. What do you think that involves?
Right. So first of all, the president and Steve Witkoff that pushed the prime minister and Hamas to get this framework of a deal that was originally presented by the Biden administration through the finish line, they now realize that they pushed into Israel into a bad deal. Okay, they've been very clear about that, and I think maybe they even feel sorry about that. But they wanted a win. They wanted a foreign policy win ahead of Trump's entry into office, and you see now that the president is changing his tune, and they no longer feel like they have to be committed to the framework that was presented by the Biden administration, because the Biden administration's negotiators are no longer relevant. They're not in the room anymore. And so you heard the president say that if all the hostages are not released by Saturday, that all hell will break loose. At the same time, you have Hamas now claiming that Israel's violating the ceasefire. Um, I don't think that the president of the United States is buying that. Certainly it's still a very tense area, and there's still gunmen running around the Gaza Strip. But Israel's pulled back from the population centers. Israel, as you mentioned, is withdrawing from the Netzarim corridor, which is a road that they paved right through the middle of the Gaza Strip in order to be able to operate security in Gaza, and they're withdrawing from that, and that's a big deal that they're withdrawing from that. Um, we've seen every week almost that each side is claiming that the other is violating the ceasefire deal. This is part of the psychological manipulation game that Hamas is playing, and this is the only card that they have to play: psychological manipulation. The first hostages that were released. Looked the best fed, and we're starting to see now, like you mentioned before, the 3 that came back. The president said that they looked like Holocaust survivors. Um, and probably the ones that are still being held look worse than these. It's horrific. So good that the president is switching his tone. I think that if he gives Israel the green light to do it, that Israel, would go back into the Gaza Strip. At the same time, you have to understand that it's this type of pressure on Hamas, and there's similar pressure being leveled on Qatar at the same time. That's the only type of pressure that's going to get Hamas to release the hostages. And even Anthony Blinken said that in his exit interview with the New York Times. He said that when it was perceived that international pressure was turning against Israel, that made Hamas harden its positions. So Hamas hears that the president is ready to empty out the entirety of Gaza and remove Hamas in it completely from the strip and from power. So I don't know what's going on in the negotiation rooms. I'm not there right now, but I'm certain that there might be some carrots. I know that Minister Dermer, who's the minister of He's the strategic affairs
He's Bibi's
minister.
right hand man.
He's the
He's always
strategic
been his
affairs
best friend.
minister, and he's
Right,
basically the vice prime minister of Israel right now.
right.
They talked about an exile plan that would be at
Hmm.
the end of the war, where Hamas would basically surrender, but they would allow free passage for Hamas's leadership to go to Qatar or to Turkey or someplace else, and Israel would get back all of the hostages. So I think that that's probably what the Israeli team is pushing for right now, and it sounds like Trump may be on board with such a plan, because if you don't wave a carrot in front of Hamas, if they don't get anything out of it, then they're not going to release the hostages. So, but we have to see how this develops over the next. I think the
Right,
next week. I mean, even the next hours with regard to this meeting between Trump and Abdullah is going to be
right,
telling, and certainly the next week
right.
and the next weeks are going to be telling. But Israel is preparing now to re-enter the Gaza Strip. But many of the troops were sent on leave, which is well deserved,
Right.
and now they're instantly being called back and mobilized. And I think it's that pressure, and also Hamas seeing that Israel is remobilizing for war, that might get some kind of much faster breakthrough, and God willing, the return of all of the hostages.
So, do you believe that for stage one, there are supposed to be 17 remaining hostages set to be released? Do you believe they're still alive?
So the 6 week deal was supposed to see
Hmm.
the return of 33 hostages, of which,
Right.
according to the Israeli estimates, I believe 25 are alive,
Mm.
meaning that they understand now that eight are dead, and also the way that the release was supposed to take place was that the women and children and men over 50 were to be released first. And so, for example, like the Bebas mother and kids, they haven't been released, and I think that that's an unfortunate indication that they may no longer be alive. Um, but what's even more worrying than those that have been killed, in captivity, um, is the the health status of those that are still living. I mean, the three that we saw this week were severely malnourished and are going to probably have permanent problems like organ failure and other things, from what they experienced in captivity. And it's believed that if there are others that are alive, that they may be even in worse condition.
So, do you believe that Israel and Hamas will proceed to phase two of the ceasefire plan, where Israel is supposed to totally withdraw from Gaza?
I don't think so. The prime minister and his team were talking about some kind of extension of phase one, but you hear the president speaking in a totally different language right now. So, I think that obviously Israel is happy that they got back the hostages they got back as part of this phase so far. These stages of phase one. If Israel can get the hostages back without releasing more terrorists, that would be better. If Israel can get back all of the hostages quickly, that's better. I mean, look at the reason why you have this, what the president called the drip and drab release of the hostages, is because the Biden administration, in its formulation of phase one of the deal, wanted to guarantee that Israel would hold fire for 6 weeks. Okay, so the only way to guarantee that Israel would hold fire for a period of 6 weeks was if hostages were released, each week, three at a time. That's the only way to keep the IDF from finishing the job. But here the president said, it's going to be up to Israel to decide if they want to end the ceasefire. So, I think that there's a strong likelihood, unless some kind of deal gets reached. Now, if you have a deal reached, right, all the hostages come back. You have the exiling of Hamas leadership and the total surrender of Hamas. Game over. Permanent ceasefire. Okay, so I think that is the pathway that the Netanyahu team and hopefully the Trump team would like to see.
Okay, so unfortunately, there are still elements within the foreign policy establishment that lack creativity, and they only see the Palestinian Authority as the alternative to Hamas, and something that looks like a deal sweetener. PA President Mahmoud Abbas said yesterday that he would end the pay for slave programs, those programs that incentivize by lavishly benefiting murderers for the killing of Israelis and Jews. Um, so, how far do you think this is going to go? According to Itamar Marcus of Palestinian Media Watch, many of these prisoners leave jail as millionaires. Do you think they're just taking the money from one fund and putting it into another, and they're still going to incentivize the murder of Jews?
Right. That's what some of the reports that I've read have stated, which is that instead of the government paying these stipends to terrorists sitting in Israeli jails and paying stipends to the families of those terrorists who were killed in the act of committing first degree murder, and you're talking about 7% of the entire Palestinian Authority budget going to these terror stipends. That's why it's called pay for slay. They're literally financially incentivizing terrorism. Um, they're saying now that perhaps some kind of NGOs would be paying those stipends and they would be getting money from something, so it could just be that the now you're going to have an indirect payment system instead of a direct payment system. I'm not going to believe that they've cut off this incentivization
Mhm.
until they do it. The proof will be in the pudding here. I mean, these are terrorists and terrorist insiders, but I think that it's telling that Mahmoud Abbas is trying to figure out some way to appease the Trump administration, because what I would hope would be a next step would be that the Trump administration would designate the Palestinian authorities a terror organization,
Right,
and that's
right. I
clearly
mean, you
some.
and I have all believed, and we saw this on October 7th when members of the PA were actually celebrating the murder of 1,900 Jews and the kidnapping of 250,
Well, there's
250.
celebration and there's free speech, and okay, we're happy that this happened or not, but then there's also the incitement to terror. There's the allowing Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad and other terror factions like Lions Den to.
I'm
Sorry,
sorry,
go
go
ahead.
ahead. Okay. Okay. Sorry about that interference. Go
Uh,
ahead.
and,
Oops.
and
Sorry.
basically, the Palestinian Authority has been inciting to violence and financing violence against Jews, and you know the Biden administration wanted to turn the Gaza Strip over to the Palestinian Authority. Uh, and that's what obviously the Palestinian Authority was pushing for, and the rest of the Arab League was pushing for that. And now we're getting to the point where the President of the United States may put the Palestinian Authority out of business. And I think it was very telling what the Prime Minister said to the cabinet last night. He said that Israel is not going to relive the mistakes of Oslo uh, ever again. And Oslo was the accords that created the Palestinian Authority and put the Israelis and Palestinians on a pathway towards a two-state solution. So the prime minister saying that that's a mistake that Israel's not going to revisit. Uh, and so I think that the president and his actions, and if he manages to clear out the Gaza Strip, that changes the entire demographic reality between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. And again, I think that this is going to put an end to the talk of dividing the tiny state of Israel into pieces and facilitating the creation of a Palestinian state within the territory that is meant to be the state of Israel.
Right. Um, so we really have to give President Trump credit because this is the breaking of the two-state paradigm, I think. Um, y- do you believe that? Or do you believe that Jordan will somehow become a Palestinian state, overthrow King Abdullah, and be a threat to Israel down the road?
I mean, when it comes to King Abdullah, all the Israeli security experts say that it is a matter of when, not if. And who knows? That could be 10 years, that could be 20 years, but at some point, the threat is real that the Palestinians will take over Jordan. Now, it's already a threat to Israel, what happens in Jordan. And you see how Iran and Turkey both have tried to destabilize Syria. And you've seen how many Syrian refugees have flooded into northern Jordan. And it's clear now that if that if Iran can't work through Syria, that they may try to destabilize Jordan as well. So I think it's a very big threat to the region. That's also one of the reasons why Israel actually prefers that Abdullah not get overthrown in the short term, because you know as much as Abdullah relies on American aid and relies on Israeli intelligence to stay in power, that keeps the majority of that territory terror free. And if he falls, and if it does become a Palestinian state, well, if you want to know what a Palestinian state's going to look like, we'll just look at Gaza. I mean, the prime minister said it on the strip. Gaza was the pilot project for the Palestinian state, and Abdullah's not a friend of Israel, but he's got a strategic interest to work with Israel and to work with America to stay in power, and he wants to stay in power. And so, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and uh, for the meantime, it's been useful for Israel to have Abdullah in place, but ultimately, um, if you're looking at what country best represents a Palestinian state, and you look at the entirety of the land that was part of the British mandate for so-called Palestine, of which all was supposed to be a Jewish state, and that included all of what is Israel today and all of what is Jordan today, and then that land was partitioned. Uh, so this land was all supposed to be Israel. When people talk about a two-state solution, well, 72% of that land is Jordan, and the majority of the people that live in Jordan, about 6 million, are of Palestinian descent. So, people always want to push Israel into creating a Palestinian state. They want to talk about Israel being an apartheid state, even though Jews are the majority even today in the land of Israel. Well, the Hashemite kingdom that runs Jordan is a 35% minority over a majority of 55% Palestinians. There's also Bedouin that live there. Um, and nobody talks about Jordan being an apartheid. But one day, yes, Jordan could be the Palestinian state, unless, of course, something gets created in Egypt or Saudi or elsewhere for the Palestinians.
So just heading north to southern Lebanon yesterday, U.S. National Security Council member Brian Youth said the ceasefire with Hezbollah is due to expire in exactly 1 week's time. We do see lots of photos of people streaming back to southern Lebanon with Hezbollah flags and photos of the now deceased Sheikh Nasrallah. Do you think the ceasefire with Lebanon will hold after the 18th? And how can we convince the administration of the necessity of stability and to be able to protect Israel's northern communities?
Well, this is actually a question that I posed directly to the prime minister in Washington, and he said when he called the ceasefire agreement with Lebanon that it was going to be a temporary ceasefire. And it called for a drawdown of Israeli troops from southern Lebanon over a period of 60 days. That has now, as you see, been extended beyond that. The new deadline for an Israeli withdrawal from southern Syria is supposed to be February 18th, I guess in just about a week from now. Um, it's clear that Israel wants to continue to postpone the drawdown from southern Syria. The prime minister had basically said to me that Israel would maintain its positions in southern Lebanon. Did I say Syria before? In southern
Yeah.
Lebanon, to what he called to maintain the ceasefire. He basically intimated that Israel doesn't want to return to all-out war with Hezbollah in Lebanon, but wants to protect the current status quo, which is to make sure that Hezbollah does not come down south below the Litani River. Um, Morgan Ortega, the new U.S. Special Envoy, said that the 18th is still a deadline, but we have to see what President Trump says. I mean, President Trump said it will be up to Israel if it breaks its ceasefire in Gaza, and we don't know from the president yet what his position is on with regard to Lebanon. But I do think that the prime minister is happy right now that missiles and drones and rockets are not pummeling Israeli territory. And I think that he is satisfied with uh, the damage that Israel has done to Hezbollah's senior leadership, mid level leadership in the Beeper episode, and the drawing down of their missile capabilities in all of their airstrikes. And especially now that Syria has fallen and Israel has taken out the entirety of the Syrian military and has basically shut off Syria from Iran, which will prevent the rebuilding of southern Lebanon and its weapons capabilities. So I think the prime minister would prefer to maintain a light Israeli presence in southern Lebanon and not to restart full on fighting with Hezbollah.
So, speaking of Syria, Alex, what are your honest views of Ahmed al-Shara or Mohammed al-Julani?
Right. I mean, Al Jolani is a former Al Qaeda. You know, the Biden administration said that he's reformed. I mean, they also said that the Yasser Arafat reformed. I mean, I think once a terrorist, always a terrorist. You know, you're not gonna, unless they move to the United States, and they prove over the period of 10 or 20 years that they're no longer a terrorist. You know, if they're still there and they're a militant group, that's terrorist and it's dangerous, and they're clearly backed by Turkey. And Turkey has sensed the vacuum in Syria. You know, Iran was weakened. You know, both their air defenses in their own territory, as well as their forward-facing army, which was Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. Uh, Iran didn't have the capacity to protect Assad anymore. The Russians were very distracted. They did not have the capacity to protect uh, Bashar al-Assad, and Assad fell because of that. And Turkey sensed that weakness, and they pushed in using Al Jolani, who's very loyal to the Turks. And it's a big threat that Turkey will now try to establish a southern command post, which could threaten the state of Israel.
Right. And getting to the true source of the instability within the Middle East. As you know, Iran has threatened President Trump's life at least twice, as well as John Bolton's, Mike Pompeo's, Brian Hook's. Do you think that President Trump will enable Israel to launch an attack on Iran?
It sounds like it's not the president's first preference. And maybe there's a fear that Iran already has a nuclear weapon. If not many. He would prefer, as he has stated openly, to try to use economic sanctions to shut off the Iranian economy. And Israel and the prime minister have been talking to the Iranian public and telling them basically to take back their country from these repressive Islamic mullahs who have really hijacked the future and the present of Iran, which was once a country was rich in culture, um, and should be friendly to the state of Israel. Um, but Trump has basically stated that if Iran does not agree to a deal that would see itself like dismantle its own nuclear program, he said that maybe Israel will strike. So I don't know that there was complete agreement between the Netanyahu team and the Trump team, on this trip. Inside sources that I spoke to said that Israel got 93% of what they were hoping on this trip. I don't know how accurate that number is, or what that 7% represents, but I have a feeling that if that 7% represents anything, it's about a timetable towards a strike against Iran and its nuclear facilities. At the same time, uh, the Trump administration did release a number of weapons that were supposed to be sent from the United States to Israel. And it's also a question mark if the United States agreed to send additional weapons that the Biden administration never would have agreed to send, including bunker busting technologies. Questions about the Moab, the mother of all bombs, these bunker busters that would allow Israel to really efficiently target the deep underground Iranian nuclear infrastructure. So perhaps the United States is gearing Israel up to do the job. I mean, before Trump came into office, there was questions about whether Trump administration might be willing to participate in a military strike against Iran. It seems as
Mhm.
though Trump doesn't want American military involvement in the Middle East. and would be very happy for Israel to do the job if they felt like they needed to do it. What the timetable is, we don't know, and this is coming up against reports that Iran is really racing towards the bomb, and obviously we've been saying that for the last 20 years, so already, so that they're racing towards the bomb, and but now reports in the New York Times that they're even looking at putting together a cruder, faster weapon. So we don't know what the real intelligence clock is ticking right now. But we're obviously playing with fire here. So the next several weeks are going to be critical in determining whether Israel is going to be striking against Iran.
Right. Okay. We have gotten some amazing questions from the audience, which I'll read. One of them was that President Trump had announced that if all hostages aren't returned by Saturday, all hell will break loose. What can Israel do that it hasn't already done? And what can the U.S. do that it hasn't already done?
Well, Israel didn't really finish the job in its entirety in Gaza, and what happened was that Israel did, let's say, 80% of the work. They destroyed what they said was like 18 or 19 of the 24 organized battalions. We've even seen since that time, since the successful Rafah operation, that Hamas has consolidated its battalions. Like when Israel says that it destroyed a battalion, what that means, according to Israeli experts, is like according to the government, they say that that means 50% of the battalion killed or injured. Basically, 50% of the battalion neutralized, which means that if you had 1,000 people in a battalion, then you still could have 400 or 500 terrorists from that battalion still running around. So now they've managed to consolidate. They've done that when Israel pivoted. At a certain point in the war, Israel is getting pummeled from the north by Hezbollah, and Israel realized that they had taken out the majority of Hamas in Gaza, and that Hamas really didn't pose much of a threat to the Israeli home front. So they really decided to put the Gaza operation on the low burn. And to divert most of the military to the north to deal with Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. Um, and then Israel's really been running like lower scale operations inside Gaza, but Hamas still operates. I mean, you've seen the parades of the hostages. There's still Hamas terrorists running around in full uniform, waving Kalashnikovs. The prime minister said that they believe that the Hamas still has as many as 10,000 Kalashnikov rifles. They probably have still a few thousand rockets at their disposal to fire. So, there's more to be done. Israel killed Yahya Sinwar, but now Mohammed Sinwar, his brother, is still running the operations in Gaza. So there's still work to be done to completely eliminate Hamas as a military threat to Israel and make sure that they cannot take command of the Palestinians either in Gaza or anywhere else for that matter, right? I'm sure that if Egypt or Jordan was going to take on Palestinian civilians, that they would be more interested in doing that if Hamas is not part of the picture anymore and if nobody's smuggling weapons across the border. So they would still want Israel to do that job.
So after the 1979 revolution in Iran, we saw that the Shah was relocated. Do you think it might be necessary to relocate King Abdullah and where?
I mean, I still think here that it's in the immediate short-term interest of Israel and the United States to keep King Abdullah in Jordan. Again, I don't think that this administration wants to see the overthrow of Abdullah, and they even showed Abdullah the respect of having him be the first Arab leader to come to the White House, as he has been over the years, with different administrations. Netanyahu was the first leader, but even Abdullah has prided himself on being the first Arab leader time and again to meet with the new administration. I do think that they see Abdullah as a useful sort of ally. Not a totally reliable ally, but compared to what could be if he wasn't there. Uh, and I mean, let's be straight about it. I mean, he continues to allow the incitement against Israel among the Palestinian street in his country, but the terrorists don't run around Jordan as they do in Syria or in Lebanon or even in some of the Palestinian territories and specifically in Gaza. So I don't think that they're going to try to relocate him.
So, one of our audience listeners said that Canada has offered to take in 5,000 Gazans, and he would expect what's been happening in Europe, see Sweden. Do you anticipate that in some Western nations there might be more volatility because they're going to naively accept some of these Gazans?
Well, I mean, I think that it's not a bad approach to really split up the population and to spread it out and to spread it out as far away as possible from Israel. And I do think that the country should open up and agree to take limited populations. I mean, obviously, if country would take 100,000 or something, that would be a very serious threat. But to take 5,000, let's get the gates open. And Israel has said that it is looking into two different options. One at the Ashdod port, which is maybe some 30 miles north of Gaza, and also via the Ramon Airport, which is the airport near Eilat, as transit points to allow Palestinians to leave. If Egypt doesn't open the border and they're not able to leave via Egypt, so I think that you have somebody has to accept the first Palestinian. So if Canada is willing to do it, I saw in the comment that Australia might be willing. There was reports several months ago that Chechnya was potentially preparing a city for Palestinians. Could be that some could be resettled in Turkey. Um, there's some laws on the books that I've seen, been told from our Turkish expert and scholar Harold Rode, that actually give benefits to Palestinians that immigrate into Turkey. So that might be an option as well. Maybe some could be resettled in Qatar. Maybe some could be resettled, elsewhere in the Arab world. And also, maybe another idea is that the Houthis in Yemen have been fighting for the Palestinians since October 7th, and maybe they should win them. So,
Right.
so maybe they could
So,
win Yemen.
to end up in a very big note, if the US or Israel attacks Iran's nuclear facilities, what response could be expected from Russia, China, or North Korea?
Well, I think that depends on the type of threats that the diplomatic threats that are placed on it by the Trump administration. I mean, I think that Trump would be very clear, ahead of time. And I don't think, by the way, that Israel would do a surprise attack at this point with this administration. I think that even if Israel is going to strike, they're going to do so with the pre knowledge and hopefully green light of the Trump administration, and can trust that the Trump administration wouldn't be leaking Israeli battle plans like the Biden and Obama administrations have been doing over the years regarding a potential nuclear strike. But I think that Trump would use all the leverage that he has with Russia and with China to make sure that they stay out of it. And this, I don't think you would see the type of campaign against Iran that you see against Gaza. Israel's not going to be going building to building in Iran. Israel doesn't have any issue with the Iranian people. Their issue is only with the top leadership. That screams death to Israel and calls to wipe Israel off the face of the map, and really only sees the nuclear weapon as an existential threat. So it would be a very limited strike on Iran's nuclear facilities. And, I think that I'm hopeful that Russia and China would stay out of it if something like that happened.
I think Russia's military has been defeated
But
in
don't
Ukraine.
forget, by the way, that Iran, it was estimated to have as many as 3,000 ballistic missiles, and they fired so far something like 4 or 500 against Israel since this war started, which would leave them still with more than 2,500 ballistic missiles. And the ones that they fired at Israel, they basically were targeting Israel's military facilities, specifically the Air Force Base in the south, and they they are not precision accurate. They're very accurate, but within a distance of about 300 meters, um, which is pretty accurate, but not pinpoint accurate. And so they didn't do too much damage to the Air Force base. But if Iran decided that they were going to launch 2,000 ballistic missiles at the state of Israel, and they would just target Tel Aviv or other population centers, even if they miss by 300 meters, 300 yards, they could still do tremendous damage to the home front and kill thousands of Israelis. Now, obviously, Israelis would be in the safe rooms, but they could do immense damage to Israel. So it's not like a riskless operation if Israel does decide to attack the nuclear facilities, but much different than if Hezbollah was still at full strength or if Hamas was still at full strength.
Thank you so much, Alex Trenman. I think everybody should support jns.org and read jns.org. And JNS is having a wonderful policy conference around Yom Ha'atzmaut at the end of May. I think anybody who can make it to Jerusalem should definitely attend. There are going to be wonderful speakers. And I also want to remind everybody that while I'm doing this, my staff is on Capitol Hill. We are there every single day fighting. We have been fighting since Oslo to talk about the failure of the Land for Peace paradigm, which unfortunately Israel and all of the wonderful Israelis, the citizens, the reservists, the soldiers, have had to deal with the effects of this. And in a world of misinformation, we've been providing accurate facts and analysis for our policymakers, and they really do appreciate us. And we really do appreciate you, Alex Trayman, and all that you have done to shed sunlight on extremely important issues and facts, and your opinion pieces are brilliant.
Well,
Thank you so much, Alex
thank
Trayman.
you for what you do and for the work of Emet that you've been providing um, such critical education on Capitol Hill, for as long as I've known you. And your organization is a little powerhouse that punches well above its weight. And I know that every dollar that comes into Emet goes a very, very long way, much further than these dollars go at some of the larger legacy Jewish organizations. You guys are little rock stars on Capitol Hill that are doing the work that unfortunately others really are not doing. So keep up the great work.
Thank you. You too. You as well. Thank you so much, everyone.